The glass shattered against the marble floor before I even understood what my father had said. "Security," Daddy said, snapping his fingers at the two men in black suits standing by the ballroom entrance. "Escort her out. This party is for family only." Before we continue, please hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Now let's continue. 200 faces turned toward me. My name is Nadia Freeman. I was 31 years old, and I was standing in the middle of my father's 50th birthday celebration at the Ridgewood Country Club in Charlotte, North Carolina, wearing a burgundy dress I'd paid $420 for, and my own father had just called security on me like I was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. "Daddy," I said, my voice cracking, "what are you talking about? I'm your daughter." Reginald Freeman didn't even look at me. He straightened his tuxedo jacket and turned back to his guests, that same charming smile he'd flash at church deacons and business partners, spreading across his face, like nothing had happened. "Adopted," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Not blood, and tonight is about blood." The room went silent except for the string quartet, who kept playing like they hadn't heard a man detonate his own daughter's life in front of 300 people. I felt my knees go weak. 26 years. 26 years since he and my mother, Delphine, had picked me up from a group home in Gastonia when I was 5 years old. 26 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, and him walking me down memory lane at every graduation, every birthday, telling everyone who'd listen how proud he was of his girl. And now, in front of his business partners, his church friends, his golf buddies, he was erasing me like a bad line in a contract. "Reginald." My mother's voice cut through the quartet's music like a blade. She was standing near the cake table in a gold gown, her hand frozen mid-air where she'd been about to cut the first slice. He didn't answer her. He nodded at the security guards again. One of them, a heavy-set man with a name tag that read Terrence, stepped toward me, and I felt my whole body go cold. That's when my mother set the cake knife down on the table with a click that somehow silenced the entire room and said the words that would change everything. "If she leaves, I leave, and I'm taking everything with me." Terrence froze mid-step, his hand hovering near my elbow, unsure whether to touch me or retreat. "Delphine," my father said through his teeth, that smile still glued to his face for the benefit of the room. "Sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm embarrassing myself?" My mother laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh that comes right before a woman burns something to the ground. "Reginald, I built Freeman and Associates from a card table in our garage on Denny Avenue. I typed every contract for the first 6 years while you were out golfing with men who wouldn't return your calls now if you called from a hospital bed. My name is on 60% of this company's founding paperwork. Ask your lawyer, Aaron, who's standing right there by the shrimp table, looking like he wants to disappear." A tall man in wire-rimmed glasses near the seafood display suddenly became very interested in his drink. I stood frozen by the door, Terrence still hovering, the whole room holding its breath. I needed the audience to understand. This wasn't just a man losing his temper. This was calculated. My father had planned this moment. I could see it now, the way he'd seated his new business partner, Curtis Boone, at the head table instead of me, the way he'd introduced a woman named Yvonne Castellano earlier that evening as someone very important to the family's future, without explaining who she was. The way his mother, my grandmother Odessa, had refused to make eye contact with me since I'd walked in. Something had been building for months, maybe years, and I had been too busy being grateful for a family that took me in to notice I was being slowly written out of it. "This is about the company," I whispered, mostly to myself, but my mother heard me. "It's about the company, the house, and the fact that your father signed papers 3 weeks ago trying to remove your name as beneficiary of my life insurance policy without telling me," my mother said, her eyes never leaving my father's face. I found out from Aaron's assistant, who felt guilty enough to call me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Curtis Boone, a stocky man with a shaved head, who I'd never met before tonight, suddenly stood up from the head table like he wanted to intervene, then thought better of it, and sat back down. My father's jaw tightened. "Delphine, not here." "You made it here, Reginald," she said. "You made it here when you decided to humiliate our daughter in front of everyone we know." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of Yvonne Castellano, whoever she was, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pity and satisfaction. The lights in the ballroom flickered as the DJ, sensing the tension, mercifully cut the music entirely. My mother reached into the small gold clutch she'd been carrying all night and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, the kind used for formal correspondence, already opened at the seal. "You want to talk about family, Reginald?" she said, holding the envelope up so the overhead lights caught it. "Let's talk about the letter that came to our house 2 weeks ago, from a woman named Yvonne Castellano." The room turned, almost in unison, toward the woman standing near the head table, mid-40s, elegant, a face that suddenly looked much less composed than it had 30 seconds earlier. "Delphine, I'm asking you to stop." My father's voice had lost its performance now. There was real fear in it. "Yvonne wrote to inform me," my mother continued, unfolding the letter with steady hands, "that she is your half-sister, Reginald. That your father, my father-in-law, God rest him, had another daughter he never told any of us about, and that you've known about Yvonne for 11 months, long enough to bring her into the company as a silent partner, long enough to start moving assets into an account she has access to." The room erupted into whispers. My grandmother Odessa's face had gone the color of ash. "That has nothing to do with Nia," my father snapped, but his voice cracked on my name, like even saying it now cost him something. "It has everything to do with Nia," my mother said, "because 3 weeks ago you told me, in our own kitchen, that you wanted to simplify the family structure before bringing Yvonne fully into the business. Simplify, that's the word you used, Reginald, like our daughter was an expense line you could cut." I felt something crack open in my chest, a mixture of grief and rage I didn't have a name for. I thought about the group home in Gastonia, about the woman there, Ms. Patricia, who used to tell me that the Freemans had chosen me, that being chosen was better than being born into a family, because chosen meant wanted. I had believed her for 26 years. Is that true? I finally found my voice, directing the question at my father for the first time since the champagne glass shattered. "Were you trying to cut me out?" My father looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all night, and I watched something flicker across his face. Not quite guilt, something closer to calculation. "Nia, you don't understand the business side of things," he started. "Then explain it to me," I said. "Right here, in front of everyone you invited to watch you humiliate me." My grandmother Odessa Freeman had not said a single word since the champagne glass shattered, but now she rose from her seat at the family table, her cane tapping once against the marble floor like a gavel. "Sit down, Mama," my father said quietly, but there was no real authority left in his voice. "I will not sit down, Reginald Earl Freeman," she said, and the use of his full name made several guests visibly flinch. "I've kept my mouth shut for 31 years. I'm done keeping it shut tonight." She turned to me, and for the first time since I'd walked into the ballroom, her eyes were soft. "Baby, come here," she said. I hesitated, glancing at Terence and the other guard, who had quietly stepped back to the wall, clearly no longer interested in escorting anyone anywhere. My mother nodded at me, so I walked across that marble floor, past 200 silent guests, and stood beside my grandmother. "When Reginald and Delphine brought you home," Odessa said, her voice carrying now, steady and clear, I did not want them to adopt you. I said some things back then I am deeply ashamed of. I told my son that blood matters, that a family built on blood was stronger than one built on choice. I was wrong, and I have watched you prove me wrong every single day for 26 years, and I never once told you that. My throat tightened. But I'll tell you something else, Odessa continued, turning now to face my father directly. Reginald's daddy, my husband Willis, had a whole other family in Rock Hill that none of us knew about until Yvonne's mother passed, and that girl came looking for answers. I made peace with that ghost 30 years ago because I had to, but I will not stand here and watch my son do to Nia what Willis did to me, erase somebody because it's inconvenient to explain them. Yvonne Castellano, still standing near the head table, had gone completely still, her hand pressed against her chest. Odessa, I didn't come here to hurt anyone, Yvonne said quietly, her first words all evening. I came here because Reginald reached out to me. He said he wanted to build a relationship. He never told me there'd be a cost to someone else. My father's composure finally cracked completely. This is not how tonight was supposed to go, he said, more to himself than anyone else, running a hand over his face. How was it supposed to go, Daddy? I asked, and for the first time, my voice didn't shake. You throw me out, everyone claps politely, and you go back to cutting cake? My cousin Renata, my father's niece, who had always treated me like a real cousin, even when other relatives kept their distance, stepped forward from the crowd, her phone gripped tightly in her hand. Uncle Reggie, she said, her voice shaking but determined. I have to say something. My father's eyes snapped to her, and something like panic crossed his face. Renata, this isn't the time. You texted me last month, Renata said, ignoring him, scrolling through her phone with trembling fingers. You asked me to help you find out if Nia had signed anything when Grandma Odessa updated her will. You said, and I'm reading this exactly, I need to know if she has legal standing before I make my move. I didn't understand what you meant then. I think I understand now. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I turned to my father, waiting for a denial, a deflection, anything. Instead, he just stood there, his jaw working, no words coming out. You were planning this, I said slowly, piecing it together in real time. Not just tonight, before tonight. You were trying to find out if I had a legal claim to anything, the business, Grandma's estate, before you decided whether I was still worth calling your daughter. It's not that simple, Nia, he finally said. Then make it simple, I shot back. Explain to me, in front of everyone, why the man who walked me down the aisle at my law school graduation 3 years ago is now asking my cousin to investigate whether I'm a legal liability. Curtis Boone, the business partner I'd never met, finally stood up fully from the head table, adjusting his jacket. Reginald, I think it's time I said something too, since apparently we're doing this here. My father's face went pale. Curtis, don't. You told me 2 months ago, Curtis said, addressing the room now, that you were restructuring ownership of Freeman and Associates to bring Yvonne on as a full partner, and that you needed Delphine's shares moved into a trust that would, in your words, streamline succession planning. You said Nia wasn't part of the long-term plan because, and again, your words, not mine, she's not really ours, and I don't want outside blood running my company after I'm gone. A woman near the back of the ballroom, someone I didn't recognize, gasped audibly and covered her mouth. I felt the floor tilt beneath me. 26 years of birthday cakes and graduation dinners, and to him, I had always been outside blood. My mother set the letter down on the cake table, next to the now collapsed 3-tier cake that Terence had accidentally bumped during all the commotion, and reached into her clutch a second time. This time, she pulled out a folded stock certificate. Reginald, do you remember what my father gave us as a wedding gift 33 years ago? She asked, her voice eerily calm now, the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times before tonight. My father didn't answer. He gave us 4 acres of land off Highway 49, the land this entire country club sits on today, my mother continued. He put it in both our names, but when we refinanced the club's founding lease 8 years ago, you had me sign papers moving my half into a joint trust, remember? You told me it was for tax purposes. Delphine, please, my father whispered. That trust, my mother said, holding up the certificate, requires both signatures to make any changes, including the change you tried to make 3 weeks ago, to remove Nia as a contingent beneficiary. Which means, Reginald, that the paperwork you signed with your lawyer isn't valid. It never was, because you forged my signature on the amendment. The room exploded into whispered chaos. Aaron, the lawyer by the shrimp table, looked like he might actually pass out. That's a felony, Reginald, my mother said, loud enough now that there was no mistaking her words for anything but a promise. Forging a legal signature on estate documents. I had my own attorney review everything the moment I found the letter from Yvonne. I know exactly what you did, and exactly how much trouble you're in. I watched my father's face crumble in real time, 26 years of carefully constructed authority disintegrating in front of the same people he'd spent decades trying to impress. I did it for the family, he said weakly. For the company, for our future. No, my mother said, and her voice broke for the first time all night, grief finally breaking through the armor of her fury. You did it because somewhere along the way, you decided that Nia, not sharing our blood, made her disposable. And I have spent 33 years loving a man who apparently believed that all along and never had the courage to say it to my face until his own mother forced it out of him tonight. She turned to me, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks, ruining the makeup she'd spent 2 hours perfecting. You are my daughter, she said, not because I chose to raise you, because you are the best part of my entire life, and I will burn every single thing your father built before I let him tell you otherwise. I don't remember deciding to speak. The words just came. I need everyone to understand something, I said, turning slowly to face the 200 guests who had come to celebrate my father's 50th birthday and instead witnessed his unraveling. I spent my whole life trying to earn a place in this family. Straight A's, full ride to law school. I came back to Charlotte instead of taking the job in Atlanta because Daddy said he needed me close. I turned down a partnership track at Whitfield and Marsh 2 years ago because he asked me to help build Freeman and Associates' legal department from scratch, for free, for 18 months, because, his words, that's what family does. I looked directly at my father now, and for the first time all night, I felt something other than grief. I felt clarity. I gave you 18 months of free legal work, Daddy. I gave you 26 years of being grateful for a love that apparently came with an expiration date the moment blood relatives showed up with a better offer. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Nia, Odessa said gently, placing a frail hand on my arm. What are you going to do? I looked around the ballroom, at Curtis Boone, who was already pulling out his phone, likely to call his own lawyer about the partnership agreements he'd apparently helped structure under false pretenses, at Yvonne Castellano, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, a woman who had simply wanted a family and gotten caught in the middle of my father's cruelty instead, at Aaron the lawyer, sweating through his shirt, at Renata, still holding her phone like evidence in a trial, at my grandmother, finally standing on the right side of history after 31 years of silence. I'm going to leave, I said, but not because Daddy called security on me. I turned to my mother. I'm leaving because I finally understand. I don't need this family's permission to know my own worth. I've spent my whole career building other people's cases. Starting Monday, I'm building my own firm. And Mama, if half of Freeman and Associates is legally yours, and you want to walk away from a man who tried to erase his own daughter from his estate to make room for people he'd known less than a year, I'll be your first client, free of charge, because that's what family does." My mother let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and grabbed my hand. Together, we walked toward the ballroom doors, past Terence, who stepped aside without being asked, past 200 guests who parted like the room itself understood something monumental had just happened. The story hit local news within 72 hours. Not because I leaked it, I never spoke to a reporter, but because someone at the country club had recorded part of the confrontation on their phone, and by Monday morning, clips of my father shouting, "Security," while his own mother stood up against him, had been viewed over 4 million times online. People started calling it the Freeman family blow-up, and comment sections filled with strangers dissecting every second of a night that had nearly broken me. Curtis Boone withdrew his partnership from Freeman and Associates within the week, citing material misrepresentations in the deal my father had structured. 2 major contracts the company depended on, including a facilities agreement with Mecklenburg County, were suspended pending an internal investigation into the forged trust documents. Aaron, the lawyer, resigned from his firm entirely rather than face a bar complaint my mother's new attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Councilwoman Bettina Marsh's former law partner, Yolanda Prescott, had already begun drafting. My mother filed for divorce 11 days after the party. She didn't cry when she told me. She just said, "I gave that man 33 years and half my company. He's not getting the rest of my life, too." Yvonne Castellano reached out to me 2 weeks later, asking to meet for coffee at a small shop on East Boulevard. I almost said no, but something told me this woman deserved to be heard on her own terms, not just as a footnote in my father's betrayal. "I didn't know about you when he first contacted me," she told me, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "I found out I had a half-brother 11 months ago, and I was so desperate for family, I didn't ask enough questions about the daughter he barely mentioned. I'm sorry, Nia, truly." I studied her face, the same eyes as my father, the same nervous habit of tapping her fingers on the table that I'd noticed in Odessa during the party. "You're not the villain here, Yvonne," I said finally. "You're just someone else he used. We didn't become close friends overnight, but we didn't become enemies either. Sometimes the people caught in another person's cruelty become the strangest kind of allies." 6 weeks after the party, I signed the lease on a small office suite on South Tryon Street, 400 square feet, a single window overlooking a parking deck, and a rent I could barely afford on my savings alone. I named the firm Marchetti Legal, using the surname of the birth mother I never got to know, a woman named Josephine Marchetti who died when I was 3 years old. It felt right, a name that belonged only to me, untangled from a family that had tried to erase me, and a father who had never fully claimed me to begin with. My mother became my first official client, exactly as I'd promised. Together, with Yolanda Prescott's firm handling the criminal referral for the forged signature, we recovered her full ownership stake in Freeman and Associates. The forgery case against my father moved slowly through the Mecklenburg County court system, but slowly is still forward, and by month 4, he'd accepted a plea deal that included probation, a substantial fine, and mandatory forfeiture of his remaining shares in the company he'd spent 30 years building. Renata came to work for me as my paralegal 3 months in. "I owed you that much," she said, "for staying quiet as long as I did." I told her the past didn't need repaying, only the future did, and she cried in my tiny office with the parking deck view like something in her had finally been forgiven. My grandmother Odessa visited every Sunday, bringing peach cobbler in a Tupperware container that had survived 3 decades of Freeman family gatherings, insisting I eat something besides cold coffee and ambition. "You were never outside blood, baby," she told me one Sunday, watching me review a contract at my desk. "You were the truest blood this family ever had. It just took the rest of us too long to earn the right to say so. I didn't speak to my father for 5 months. When he finally called, his voice sounded smaller than I remembered, stripped of the performance that used to fill every room he walked into. "I don't expect you to forgive me," my father said, sitting across from me in a coffee shop on a rainy Tuesday in April, 10 months after the party that ended everything and somehow started everything else. "I just needed you to know that I understand now what I did." I studied him, the gray that had crept fully into his beard, the weight he'd lost, the way his hands shook slightly around his cup. "Why did you do it, Daddy?" I asked, and I realized it was the first time I'd called him that since the ballroom. He was quiet for a long time, because somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that love built on choice wasn't as real as love built on obligation. I thought bringing Yvonne in, giving her blood ties to the business, would somehow make the company more legitimate, more permanent. I thought you'd always be there no matter what I did, because that's what you'd always done. I mistook your loyalty for something that would never run out. It almost didn't, I admitted. That's the part that scares me most. "I lost the company," he said. "I lost your mother. I nearly lost Yvonne too, because she couldn't stand what I did to you. But losing you the way I did that night, watching you walk out that door with your mother, knowing I'd earned it, that was the loss that actually broke something in me." I didn't tell him everything was fine. It wasn't. Some things, once broken, simply become different, not repaired. But I told him I was willing to let him earn something new, slowly, on terms that were mine this time, not his. Marchetti Legal has 14 employees now. My mother remarried last spring, a quiet, steady man named Louis Prescott, Yolanda's older brother, who looks at her like she invented sunlight. Odessa still brings peach cobbler every Sunday, though now she brings enough for the whole office. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that little girl in the Gastonia group home who believed being chosen meant being permanently wanted, and I want to tell her the truth I learned the hard way, standing in a ballroom while a room full of strangers watched my whole world nearly collapse. Family isn't something you're given, and it isn't something blood guarantees either. It's something you build, brick by brick, choice by choice, and if the people around you won't help you build it, you find the strength to lay the first brick yourself, and you don't stop until the whole thing is standing, sturdy and unshakable, on ground that's finally, completely your own. If this story made you think, smile, or even gave you chills, show it some love with a like, and subscribe for more powerful stories. And before you go, tell me in the comments what you think happened next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.